There are stories buried so deep in the soil of the American South that even the land itself seems unwilling to speak about them. Stories whispered only in fragments, stories passed down without names, without dates, without proof, and yet somehow they never disappear. Before we begin, let me ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments. If protecting your family meant destroying someone else's life, would you do it? Pause the video for a moment if you need to, then write your answer below. Because the man at the center of this story made that exact choice. This is not a tale of heroes and villains. It's a story of power, silence, and a decision that haunted an entire community for generations. There are places in this world where history does not speak loudly. It whispers. The American South was one of those places, a land where beauty and brutality lived side by side, where magnolia trees bloomed over soil soaked with generations of suffering, and where silence was not accidental, it was designed. For centuries, silence was the rule. You learned when to speak, and more importantly, when not to. Plantations stretched across the land like kingdoms, not just fields of cotton and sugarcane, but systems built on obedience, fear, and carefully enforced ignorance. Outwardly, everything appeared orderly. White columns, wide porches, polite smiles exchanged in town squares and Sunday churches. But beneath that polished surface was a truth no one wanted to name. Because naming it would mean responsibility, and responsibility was dangerous. In this world, power did not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it came quietly, with a nod, a look, or a rumor that never needed to be confirmed. People understood the hierarchy without it ever being written down. At the top stood men who owned land and with it controlled lives. Below them were those who depended on that land for survival. And beneath even that were those whose voices were never meant to be heard at all. Silence was survival. You did not ask questions about what happened behind closed doors. You did not challenge the word of powerful families, and you certainly did not interfere in matters that were considered private. Because private in the South often meant untouchable. There were stories, of course. Every town had them. Stories whispered at the edges of conversations, stories shared only after dark, stories that never reached paper, never reached courtrooms, and never reached justice. They were passed down like warnings. Don't go near that house. Mind your business. Some things are better left alone. And people listened, because those who didn't often disappeared from polite society, or worse, became examples. This was the world into which our story is set, a world where reputation mattered more than truth, where appearances outweighed morality, where a respected name could bury almost anything. And in the center of this silent landscape stood one plantation, vast, prosperous, and admired. From the outside, it was a symbol of Southern success. From the inside, it was something else entirely. Before we go further, take a moment and think about this. Have you ever lived in a place where everyone knew something was wrong, but no one ever spoke about it? If that question resonates with you, share your thoughts in the comments below. The land itself seemed to remember. Even long after the footsteps of the enslaved had faded, even after the laughter and cruelty had vanished into history, The ground held its breath, as if waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to break the silence. Because silence protects power, and power, once challenged, does not surrender quietly. By the time our story truly begins, this plantation had already mastered the art of concealment. Nothing that happened here was accidental. Nothing was misunderstood. Every choice was deliberate. Every silence was enforced. And at the center of it all was a man who understood that truth better than anyone else. A man whose name commanded respect, fear, and obedience.
He was a man people trusted. That was the most dangerous thing about him. In public, the plantation owner was admired, spoken of with reverence. A man of means, a man of influence, a man who understood how the South worked and how to keep it working in his favor. He attended church every Sunday, sat in the front pew, donated generously, spoke softly but with authority. When he entered a room, conversations lowered, not because he demanded attention, but because his presence commanded it. People listened when he spoke, and when he remained silent, they listened even harder. He was known as a man of discipline. His land was orderly, his accounts precise, his household ran without visible chaos. To outsiders, this was proof of character. To those who lived under his rule, it was proof of something else: control. Every person on that plantation understood their place. Every movement was observed, every mistake remembered. But no one questioned him, because questioning men like him was unthinkable. He had built his reputation carefully over decades. One good deed spoken loudly, one cruelty buried quietly. That balance was everything, and nowhere was that balance more fragile than inside his own home. Behind the closed doors of the plantation house, the rules changed. What was expected outside did not always apply within. And the most closely guarded secret in that household was not the money, or the land, or even the brutality that sustained it. It was his daughter. She was rarely seen. When she was, people noticed things they couldn't explain. Her absence from social gatherings, her withdrawn nature, the way conversations abruptly shifted when her name was mentioned. Questions formed, but died before they could be asked. Because everyone understood the unspoken rule: you do not pry into the affairs of powerful men. The plantation owner ensured that rule was followed. Any whisper that grew too loud was silenced, any curiosity redirected. And for years it worked, because fear is a powerful ally. To the world, he was a respectable patriarch. To those who depended on him, he was unavoidable. And to those trapped within his walls, he was absolute. The tragedy was not that people didn't know something was wrong. It was that they knew and chose to look away, because silence, once normalized, feels safer than truth. But silence cannot last forever, and soon a decision would be made, a decision that would bring an outsider into this carefully controlled world, someone whose presence would disrupt the balance, someone whose existence would force the truth closer to the surface. If you're finding this story unsettling so far, stay with us and consider subscribing to The Silent South, where we uncover the stories history tried to bury. The daughter existed more as a rumor than a presence. People in town knew her name, but few could say they truly knew her.
She did not attend social gatherings. She was absent from church on most Sundays. When she was mentioned, voices lowered, as if even speaking her name risked crossing a line. Those who had seen her described her carefully, too carefully. They spoke of her pale complexion, her quiet manner, her tendency to avoid eye contact. But no one ever spoke of her thoughts, or her desires, or what she wanted from the world. It was as if she had been reduced to a fragile object, something to be protected or hidden. Within the walls of the plantation house, her life followed a rigid routine. Meals were brought to her, lessons were arranged privately, contact with outsiders was limited and supervised. She was never allowed to wander freely, not across the land, not through the town, and certainly not beyond the boundaries set by her father. To some, this seemed like care. To others, it felt like confinement. Her condition was often cited as the reason. People were told she was unwell, delicate, in need of protection from the harshness of the world. But no doctor's visits were discussed openly. No clear diagnosis was ever shared. And in a society obsessed with appearances, that absence raised quiet questions. Questions that no one dared to voice aloud. She spent long hours alone. Time moved differently in isolation. Days blurred together. Seasons passed unnoticed. The plantation, with all its activity and noise, might as well have been another world. From her window she could see the fields, vast and endless. Rows of laborers moving in rhythm, their lives dictated by bells and commands. Freedom and captivity, separated by little more than distance. What made her situation particularly tragic was not only her isolation, but her awareness of it. She was not ignorant. She understood enough to know that her life was not like those of other women her age. She understood that choices were being made on her behalf, and she understood who was making them. Her father visited her regularly, not as a tyrant, but as a presence. Sometimes he spoke kindly, sometimes he brought gifts, books, small comforts. But his kindness carried weight. Every interaction reinforced a single truth. Her world existed because he allowed it to. Over time, the rumors evolved. Some claimed she was unstable. Others suggested she was being protected from scandal. And a few, the boldest, or perhaps the most reckless, wondered whether she was being hidden not from the world, but from the consequences of something that had already happened. The truth, whatever it was, remained locked behind closed doors, and the longer it stayed there, the more dangerous it became. Because secrets do not fade with time, they grow, they press outward, they distort reality, and eventually they demand to be acknowledged. That is what makes it unsettling. It was not impulsive. It was not emotional. It was calculated. Somewhere between routine and secrecy, the plantation owner came to a conclusion. Whatever problem existed within his household could not be solved by doctors, neighbors, or prayer. It required something else, something that could be controlled. Shortly after, a man was brought onto the plantation. He was not new to labor, not unfamiliar with hardship, but his arrival was unusual. He was assigned tasks that kept him close to the house, closer than most enslaved men were ever allowed. His movements were monitored, his duties specific, his presence intentional. No explanation was given, and none was asked. To the outside world, this was simply another laborer. To those paying closer attention, it was a deviation from routine, one that did not go unnoticed. Inside the plantation house, the dynamic shifted. The daughter's isolation changed subtly, not lifted, but altered. There was more structure, more supervision, more insistence on routine. The father believed he was managing a situation, containing it, correcting it. But control has limits, especially when built on denial. The enslaved man understood the danger of his position. He understood that proximity to power was never a privilege, it was a risk. Every instruction carried unspoken consequences. Every glance meant something, and refusal was not an option. Over time, lines blurred, not visibly, not openly, but in ways that unsettled everyone involved. The plantation continued its daily rhythm. Bells rang, fields were worked, meals were served. Yet beneath that surface, something irreversible was taking shape. The decision that was meant to preserve order instead destabilized it, because it forced too many truths into too small a space, and no amount of authority could fully contain them. What followed was not chaos, at least not immediately. It was tension, a tightening, a sense that something was wrong, even if no one could articulate exactly what it was. The plantation owner believed he had chosen the lesser evil. He believed he was protecting his name, his family, his standing in the community. But history has a way of judging such choices harshly, not by intention, but by consequence. And the consequences were already unfolding, quietly, relentlessly, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. From the outside, nothing appeared to have changed. The plantation still woke with the sun. Work still began at the same hour. Meals were served on time. Orders were given. Obedience followed. Routine has a way of disguising disruption. When life continues as expected, people assume that nothing is wrong. But inside the plantation walls, the atmosphere had shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly. It was a tension that lived in glances, in pauses that lasted a fraction too long, in instructions delivered with unnecessary precision. The enslaved workers noticed first. They always did. Those closest to power are often the most aware of its instability. Movements near the house were more restricted. Conversations were monitored. Tasks were reassigned without explanation, and certain areas, once accessible, were no longer permitted. Inside the main house, the daughter's days followed a rigid structure. She was rarely alone now. Supervision had replaced isolation. Where there once was emptiness, there was now constant presence. But presence did not mean companionship. It meant observation. The father believed structure would prevent disorder, that predictability would suppress uncertainty. He enforced schedules, demanded compliance, corrected deviations swiftly. Control, to him, was synonymous with safety. But control does not eliminate fear. It concentrates it. The enslaved man assigned closest to the house became an unspoken focal point. He was watched more closely than others, corrected more harshly, moved frequently as if no place was meant to become familiar. Everyone understood what that meant. Familiarity created risk. He spoke little, not because he lacked thoughts, but because he understood the cost of expressing them. Silence was not submission, it was calculation. At night, the plantation changed. Sounds carried differently in the dark. Footsteps echoed longer. Doors seemed louder. Whispers felt dangerous. The house itself seemed to listen. The daughter spent many nights awake. Her sleep did not come easily. Her world had narrowed to a series of rooms, faces, and unspoken expectations. She had learned not to ask questions. Questions led to disappointment, or worse. At this point, consider this carefully. When routine hides cruelty, is it easier to ignore or harder to confront? If you've ever seen silence mistaken for peace, share your thoughts in the comments. The father watched everything, or believed he did. He mistook stability for stillness, compliance for resolution. But beneath that calm surface, pressures were building. Not explosively, gradually. What he failed to understand was that systems built on fear require constant reinforcement. The moment attention drifts, control weakens, and control was beginning to slip. No one spoke of it openly, but everyone felt it, a sense that something was coming, something unavoidable.
Rumors do not need evidence to survive. They only need repetition. And once planted, they spread in ways no one can fully control. At first, the whispers were indistinct, half-formed thoughts, loose observations, casual remarks that lingered longer than intended. Why was the daughter never seen? Why had routines changed? Why did certain men move differently near the house? No single question was dangerous, but together they formed a pattern. In town, conversations shifted subtly. People spoke more carefully, listened more intently. They watched the plantation from a distance, not with curiosity, but with concern. Concern disguised as politeness. The father noticed the change, not in words, but in behavior. Longer stares, shorter conversations, an absence of the easy familiarity he once enjoyed. Respect was still there, but it had cooled. He responded the only way he knew how, by tightening control. Information became more restricted, access more limited, interactions more managed. He believed secrecy would smother speculation. Instead, it fueled it. The enslaved community felt the shift acutely. Restrictions bred anxiety. Anxiety bred mistakes. Mistakes were punished, and punishment bred resentment. The man closest to the house felt the pressure most intensely. He understood that suspicion did not need proof. If blame was required, it would be assigned, not based on guilt, but convenience. The daughter sensed it too, a tension she could not articulate, but could not escape. She felt watched, not only by her father, but by the house itself, by the land, by a world waiting for something to go wrong. Silence no longer felt protective. It felt fragile, as if one wrong sound could shatter everything. The tragedy of whispers is that they are rarely confronted directly. They grow unchecked, distorted, amplified, until truth becomes irrelevant.
and by the time anyone attempts to control them, they have already escaped. The plantation stood unchanged. The routines continued, but the silence that once protected power had begun to betray it. The daughter's world had narrowed to details. Light through a window at a certain hour, footsteps in the hallway, the sound of a door closing somewhere in the house. Time no longer moved forward, it repeated. Days were measured not by events, but by absences. Absence of freedom, absence of choice, absence of explanation. She understood far more than anyone gave her credit for. She understood that her life was being managed, that decisions were being made around her, not with her. She understood that what was happening was not temporary, and that realization settled heavily. The house had become a system. Every room carried expectation. Every interaction followed a script. Her father spoke to her carefully, as one might speak to something fragile or volatile. His concern was genuine. So was his control. He rarely asked how she felt. Instead, he asked if she was calm, if she was cooperative, if she understood what was expected of her. And she learned quickly that the correct answer was always yes. Her internal life became her only refuge. Thoughts she never voiced, questions she never asked. She imagined other lives, lives where her presence was not an inconvenience. But imagination, too, had limits. What troubled her most was not fear. It was confusion. Confusion about responsibility. She had been told repeatedly that she was the cause of concern, that her condition required management, that the sacrifices being made were for her own good. Over time, those ideas took root. She began to question herself, to wonder whether the restrictions were deserved, whether her existence truly posed a threat. Guilt became habitual. The enslaved man's presence was a constant reminder that her situation was not isolated. She noticed the careful way he moved, the restraint in his voice, the unspoken tension that followed him. They rarely spoke, but silence, when shared, creates its own understanding. She recognized in him a familiarity with powerlessness, different in form, identical in consequence. At night, her thoughts grew heavier. Sleep brought no relief. She replayed conversations, reconstructed moments, searching for a point where something could have gone differently. But the truth she struggled to accept was simple. Her life had been shaped long before she understood she had one. And what frightened her most was not what had happened, but what was still being decided.
There is a moment when boundaries stop being debated and start being ignored. Not suddenly, but gradually. So gradually that those involved convince themselves nothing has truly changed. The decision that altered everything did not announce itself. It arrived disguised as necessity. A series of small allowances, minor adjustments, each one justified, each one defended.
The father framed his choices as practical. He believed the situation required management, not morality. Rules could bend, he reasoned, if bending preserved order. But lines exist for a reason. Once crossed, they do not reappear. The enslaved man found himself placed in positions that carried expectation. Not spoken, not written, understood. Expectation enforced by consequence. The daughter sensed the shift immediately. Something intangible had changed, a tightening in the air, a weight in routine. She felt it without needing explanation. Her compliance was no longer enough, her silence no longer sufficient. Something more was being demanded. What followed was not dramatic. There were no raised voices, no overt violence. That was what made it dangerous, because when wrongdoing wears the mask of calm, it feels permissible. Each participant carried a different understanding. The father saw containment, the system saw obedience, the daughter saw inevitability, the enslaved man saw survival. And in that collision of perspectives, responsibility dissolved. No one claimed ownership of the harm. It simply occurred. The plantation continued functioning. Fields were worked, meals were served. But something essential had fractured. The invisible line had been crossed. And once crossed, it demanded acknowledgement. Power, when it abandons restraint, does not stabilize. It destabilizes everything it touches. The father believed he could manage the consequences, that authority would shield him, that silence would protect what remained. But silence had already begun to betray him, because the truth, once distorted, cannot be contained forever. Control rarely collapses all at once. It erodes, piece by piece, so gradually that those who depend on it often convince themselves it still exists long after it has begun to fail. The plantation owner continued to issue orders. On paper, nothing had changed. The same routines, the same expectations, the same hierarchy. But authority depends not only on commands, it depends on belief. And belief was weakening. He noticed it in small things, a hesitation before obedience, averted eyes, questions that were not asked but implied. The unquestioned compliance he had relied on was becoming conditional. In response, he tightened restrictions. Movement was limited further. Access became selective. Information was compartmentalized. He believed fragmentation would restore order. Instead, it created confusion, and confusion breeds fear. Fear spreads faster than control. Within the enslaved community, tension reached a constant hum. People spoke less, but thought more. They sensed instability the way one senses a coming storm, not through evidence, but through atmosphere. The man closest to the house became increasingly isolated, not officially punished, not openly accused, but distanced. Isolation was safer than resolution. It allowed uncertainty to linger without accountability. He understood the danger of that position. In systems built on hierarchy, ambiguity is lethal. When blame has not yet chosen its target, everyone near power becomes vulnerable. Inside the house, the daughter's life narrowed further. What little autonomy remained was replaced with instruction. She was told where to sit, when to speak, when to remain silent. Even her expressions were monitored. Her father watched her closely, not out of cruelty, but fear. Fear that something might surface. fear that something already had. He began revisiting decisions, not questioning them, but justifying them, reframing them as unavoidable, as necessary, as rational responses to an impossible situation. This is how control attempts to preserve itself, by rewriting intention. But the world outside the plantation was not as contained as he believed. Conversations in town had shifted, not openly confrontational, but observant. People noticed patterns. They noticed absences. They noticed how carefully certain topics were avoided. Avoidance draws attention. The plantation owner felt scrutiny where once there had been deference. He responded with politeness, with generosity, with public displays of stability. But performance cannot substitute for trust, and trust, once eroded, does not return easily. What he failed to understand was that his power had always depended on silence maintained by others. Once that silence became uncomfortable, it ceased to function. Control was slipping, not dramatically, not visibly, but irreversibly. Truth does not arrive as a revelation. More often, it advances slowly, incrementally, until denial becomes impossible. The first signs were indirect. A question asked too plainly, a rumor repeated too confidently, an assumption spoken aloud, each one insignificant alone, together undeniable. The plantation owner sensed the shift. He began receiving fewer invitations. Conversations ended sooner. People listened politely, but no longer leaned in. Respect had not vanished, but it had transformed into distance. He responded by fortifying boundaries. Private matters became strictly private, schedules rigid, interactions scripted. He believed that tightening the circle would protect what remained hidden. But secrets do not shrink under pressure. They surface. The enslaved man found himself under increasing scrutiny, not from one source, but many. Supervision increased, tasks altered without explanation. The system was positioning him, not yet accusing, but preparing. He understood what that meant. Truth does not require justice to be dangerous. It only requires a target. The daughter became aware that the atmosphere around her had changed. People spoke differently, moved differently. She sensed expectation, as if others were waiting for something from her. Her father began to speak more carefully, less command, more reassurance. But reassurance, when forced, reveals insecurity. He had begun to realize that silence could no longer guarantee containment. The truth was no longer confined to the house. It existed beyond it now, in fragments, in interpretation, in speculation. And speculation is uncontrollable. What made this moment dangerous was not exposure itself. It was uncertainty. No one knew exactly what was true, only that something was wrong. And when societies sense wrongdoing without clarity, they do not seek understanding, they seek resolution. The plantation stood unchanged. The routines continued. but the space between appearance and reality had become too wide to ignore. What had once been concealed was now approaching recognition, not formally, not legally, but socially. And social judgment often precedes consequence. The truth had not yet been spoken, but it was no longer silent. Before this story goes any further, pause and consider this. If the truth destroys a powerful family but protects the reputation of a community, should it still be told? Take a moment. Let that question sit with you. The truth did not arrive as a confession. It emerged the way truths often do in closed societies, through pressure. Pressure from unanswered questions. Pressure from inconsistencies. Pressure from a silence that had begun to feel unnatural. What finally surfaced was not a single revelation, but a convergence. Details long kept separate began aligning. Timelines overlapped. Explanations contradicted one another. What had once been dismissed as rumor now carried coherence. The plantation owner found himself no longer directing the narrative. He was responding to it. Questions reached him indirectly, through intermediaries, through implication. No one accused him outright, but accusation was no longer necessary. Inside the plantation house, the atmosphere became unbearable. Words were chosen carefully, movements measured. Everyone understood that something irreversible was approaching. The daughter was asked, for the first time, to explain herself. Not publicly, not formally, but quietly, as if clarity could be extracted without consequence. What she offered was fragmented, not because it was false, but because it had never been permitted to exist as a whole. Her life had been narrated for her, by others. She struggled to separate memory from expectation, responsibility from obedience, what she knew from what she had been told to believe. The enslaved man was questioned as well, not to understand, but to locate liability. His words were weighted differently, filtered, interpreted. Truth does not arrive in a vacuum. It enters systems already prepared to accept or reject it. And this system had already decided what it could tolerate. What emerged was not justice. It was explanation. An explanation designed to restore balance without dismantling power. Responsibility became diffuse. Circumstances were blamed, misunderstandings emphasized, no single decision acknowledged as decisive. The plantation owner spoke calmly. He framed his actions as necessity, as protection, as responses to conditions no one else had been willing to address. And many accepted that framing, because it was easier than confronting what it implied. The truth was spoken, but it was spoken selectively, carefully, in a way that preserved hierarchy while acknowledging damage. The most uncomfortable realization was not what had happened. It was who was allowed to speak and who was not. The truth had surfaced, but it had not liberated everyone equally.
After the truth was spoken, life did not stop. That was the first lesson. The plantation remained, the land unchanged,
Routines resumed, adjusted but intact. Consequences followed, but not evenly. The plantation owner did not lose everything. He lost influence, subtle influence. Invitations ceased. Conversations shortened. But his position endured. His name remained. The system recalibrated around him, not to punish, but to absorb. Power rarely destroys its own. It adapts. The daughter's life changed in ways both visible and invisible. She gained distance from scrutiny, but not freedom. Her story remained partially untold, defined more by discretion than acknowledgement. She was no longer hidden, but she was not heard. The enslaved man bore the greatest consequence, not through formal accusation, but through removal, reassignment, disappearance from the narrative. History would remember him vaguely, if at all. This imbalance was not accidental. It reflected the priorities of the world that produced it, a world more concerned with order than justice. No formal reckoning followed, no public accounting, no dismantling of the conditions that made the events possible. Time moved on, as it always does, and with time, memory softened, details blurred. What remained was a version of events comfortable enough to endure. The danger of such endings is not that they fail to punish. It is that they normalize. They teach future generations what can be endured, what can be concealed. The plantation eventually faded into history, but the silence it perfected did not. It traveled into stories untold, into questions unanswered, into the quiet spaces where power still expects compliance. This was not a story about a single family or a single place. It was about a structure that allowed harm to exist without resolution. And that structure, in many forms, still exists. Some stories end with closure. Others end with silence. If this story stayed with you, if it made you uncomfortable, reflective, or angry, that reaction matters. These histories survive only when people are willing to confront them. If you believe stories like this should not disappear into silence, like this video so it reaches more people. Share it with someone who values truth over comfort. And most importantly, leave a comment, not about what you were told to think, but about what you took away from it. Subscribe to The Silent South for more stories history tried to bury. Stories where power, silence, and consequence collide. Because silence only wins when no one listens.